Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us. And today we are continuing our journey through the Tao Te Ching, and we are currently in chapter 56, I believe. Let me go ahead and pull up the screen, and we'll go ahead and get started. Yeah, chapter 56. And this week we're working with the Feng and English translation. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Those who know do not talk. So I'm going to stop talking now. No, just kidding. Those who talk do not know. This is one of the more famous quotes from the Tao Te Ching. And it's rather interesting because, how can a book that's spending 81 chapters talking about something state this? And I think we start with the idea that whoever's saying this is talking about, let's say, knowing the Tao. And so the idea is if you know the Tao, you don't talk about it. And those who try to talk about it don't really know what the Tao is. But that really wouldn't make sense in the case of this book, because what is the whole book about? And why does this person even continue after this sentence to write anything? And I don't think it's a distinction between speaking versus writing. It's, this idea of communication. And so I think we're going to have to hold this a little bit aside for a moment as we go through the rest of the text to get a sense of where, like, in what way do they mean that those who know do not talk and those who don't, and those who talk do not know. But maybe we'll pause for a second and see if you guys have any initial thoughts about what this might be referring to. Or if I guess another question would be, have you ever actually heard this phrase before?
I've not heard the phrase specifically in this context, but I think I know what it's getting at. Um, I feel like I've met quite a few people in my life that are incessant talkers who just consistently just have to say something just for the sake of talking, and it ends up being just empty words. Like what they're talking about has no purpose, no point. Not there's no meat and potatoes behind it. And I think that's kind of where my mind goes when I read this phrase.
Yeah, it's good to hear that you're not a vegetarian. I'm just kidding. But it's been spending some time thinking about and reading about different nutritional approaches, and it's interesting different phrases that kind of belie different focuses on things, and meat and potatoes is one of them.
It's the broccoli and carrots.
The broccoli and carrots. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts, Taylor?
Yeah, to me it's saying like if you have to say it, then it's probably not true. Like, if you're at an event and somebody goes, "We're having fun,"
Mm,
right?
mm,
Then chances are they're kind of checking to see if people are having fun because they don't think people are having fun. Um, so I feel like if you're having to talk about it, then you're kind of preoccupied with how you're being viewed
mm,
by other people and not necessarily with uh with truly knowing.
mm. Yeah. So I think even with these preliminary thoughts, there's ways that we can understand this phrase that don't mean that if somebody actually knows something that they can't, for example, teach it or write about it. But there's a context in which, because of their and how they're talking, it unveils the fact that they really don't know what they're talking about. And frequently, when somebody isn't speaking, then that also can give a certain kind of an impression, right? So what kind of impression comes across when somebody's not so quick to speak?
For me, it's they're involved, like they're actually in the moment, they're listening, they're absorbing information and not necessarily well, I guess it could be either way. They're not talking because they're afraid of what they'll be or how they'll be perceived or
Mm,
judged. Or they're not talking because they're listening.
yeah.
Yeah, Taylor just said exactly what I was going to say is I always view people who are silent are ones that are just listeners.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, right? Like what's going on in their head. And it could be that they're actually really smart or not, but you don't know. It makes you wonder a little bit about what's going on there. Yeah. Well, let's see where this chapter takes it. And I'll just suggest at the beginning that what's being talked about here is not specifically like those who know something about Tao or Taoism or something along those lines, but something a little bit different. And I think the rest of the chapter will start to unfold what that is actually referring to. So if we're going to get to the place where we actually know is where it's going to go next. So if we want to be one of the people who know, what kinds of things do we need to do? And a part of what the Daodejing is trying to bring to light for us is that there's an experiential aspect of, let's say, Tao, but the world more in general and ourselves, maybe more in particular, that needs to be experienced rather than some other way of trying to understand it, right? That there's an experiential aspect that really can't be communicated. And I've talked about in the past riding a bicycle. So there's you can watch videos and you can hear somebody talk about it and you can understand the mechanics of it, but until you actually get on a bike and try to do it, you don't really understand it. But once you do it and you experience it, then there's a level of knowing that is almost more bodily. It's not something that you can communicate the totality of what does it mean to be able to ride a bike until you actually do it. And so this is one of the aspects they're trying to say about the world is that language has to always be somewhat suspicious, or we need to be suspicious of language because it can't fully communicate the totality of what it is to be alive. And when we use language, it's always concerning because we might not all be exactly on the same page in terms of meanings. And so we might be miscommunicating. And the other aspect is that language tends to break things up into individual things, whereas there's a deeper underlying reality in which everything is actually connected. And so there's a couple of different ways that language can be problematic. It doesn't fully express the totality of how we experience life. It can be miscommunicating because we might have different definitions of things or different understandings of what words mean. And then there's the problem of how it, in a certain sense, misrepresents what reality is because it needs to actually break things apart into separate things. So that's another key aspect within the Tao Te Ching about language that needs to come into consideration when we're thinking about this chapter. So it starts with, if we're going to move into this place of trying to actually know or to understand, says close your mouth. So, be quiet so you can start to listen or start to experience. And then it says guard your senses. Now, one of the other themes that we've seen running throughout is that there are things that either society or culture can start to apply uh, expose us to, let's say, that tries to grab our attention, to grab our desires, to shape our values and the way that we see the world, so that we start to want to chase after the things that the larger culture is telling us we should be chasing after. But the problem that they would say is that those desires that are being cultivated in us are not necessarily good for us. They might be good for whoever's in control, but we need to be careful because it can put us in a direction that's not necessarily in alignment with the larger reality of how life works. And this is where a lot of the critique of culture comes in. So, if we're going to get at more of a clear understanding of the nature of reality, we have to be careful about the things that are tempting us down different roads. So, there's this, we want to be careful about guarding our senses and how it might capture our desires for different things. And this is an interesting one. It says, temper your sharpness. What do you think that might refer to?
Initially, it's saying to me like manage your manage your temper, which is funny because it
Hmm,
says temper your sharpness.
interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting, so temper in this case would be almost kind of like blunt or dull, the sharpness.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the other
And
meaning of temper.
yeah, so somebody having a sharp temper, that's an interesting turn of phrase. Again,
Yeah.
interesting with the language, was that where they were going? Um, it's interesting how people, the use of words can have intended meanings that are unintended depending on the cultural context. I suspect here it has more to do with the idea of our temptation to divide things. So if we're a sharp knife, one of the things we do is we cut and we divide, and so we get into these, like, is this good? Is this bad? Is this right? Is this wrong? And a lot of different ways that we try to cut things up or divide them in different ways. And this is suggesting maybe we don't want to do that so much. Maybe we want to kind of pull back in those ways that we are tempted to carve up the world into these neat little boxes, because it's a little bit of a short circuit. If we can put somebody in this box, then we don't really have to take this particular situation and this particular person into consideration. We can just kind of group it with a bunch of other things. And one of the other features that the Tao Te Ching really wants to emphasize is that there are no two situations that are identical. Everything is always, in a sense, unique because there's so many different things that are involved in what happens in each moment, that there's always uniqueness to the situation that needs to be taken into consideration. And our temptation to group things into categories or into blocks or stereotypes, or value judgments can become problematic in our experience of what is. So this idea of blunting our sharpness, or bringing that in to not be so quick to decide, is, I think, what's happening here with this idea of sharpness. Does that make sense? Are you following that line of thought?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Then it says, simplify your problems. And I believe this is the one that's talking about, in more literal terms, untying knots. So this idea of, things all tangled up, how do we untangle them? How do we get them untied? So simplify the problems, and we can create very complex lives or social situations. And this is a little bit of, let's back that up. Let's become a little bit more simplified in how we're trying to live, how we're orchestrating our business, how we're, going about life. We'll be better off if we can find ways to simplify. And I think we can experience that in a lot of different ways in our world. I mean, there's, we've just been thinking about some different insurance stuff recently in our household, and that's a crazy maze. I mean, trying to sort out all the different things that come into effect when you're thinking about insurance and the different providers that do different things. And it's is far from being simple, right? And so much of our life is that way, whether we're talking about some banking or investing ideas, or how do we think about, when we go out with friends, all the stuff we have to weigh in terms of, well, what's going to happen if we don't invite this person or whatnot. Things can become complicated very quickly, and it's a lot to maintain that complexity. So this idea of how do we start to simplify things, and in lots of areas, I think becomes very important. I've been very intrigued by more of the minimalist movement on different things. How to not have like clutter and other stuff in my life, but also even in thinking about things like diet and exercise and these kinds of things, how can we simplify those, make them easier so they're not so complicated? Have you come across this challenge of the complexity versus simplifying aspects in your life?
Definitely. And I looked into the minimalist stuff too for a while, and I at one point like didn't have a living room. It was
Hmm.
just a room with some plants in it, and then I had my bedroom. Um, and it it was nice. It like makes you worry less about, oh, I have this couch. I've got to make sure like the pillows are always situated nicely, or I have this bookshelf and I have to make sure it's dusted, or the books on it are in order, or this and that, It takes all those little worries away,
Hmm.
and kind of lets you focus on other, I don't want to say more important things, because to some people those things are important. Um, but it lets you focus on the things that you want to focus on. If that's not something you're interested in, then it lets you hone your attention in on the things that you really want to pay attention to.
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed it's probably kind of funny for me to talk about minimalism with my very cluttered bookshelf behind me. It's kind of funny. You were talking about the
Yeah, but
book.
you've read those books.
Well, and that's always the trick, right? Is it's not just about uh, getting rid of useless things, maybe, or things that don't actually serve you. And so, with somebody who does the kinds of things I do, the books are actually kind of like my tools. So
Yeah.
they are something that I use, but it does still become something you have to figure out. Well, what do I do with all these, and where do I put them? And yeah, it's an ongoing challenge in my world in terms of where do the books go, and which ones do I hold on to, which ones do I let go?
For me, it was kind of more of an environmental thing. I was vegan at the time.
Mm,
Um, I had been vegan for, I don't know, probably 4 years or so. And I really started to get into the materials that I was
mm,
buying as a consumer. So a lot of the things that I bought were either metal, glass, or bamboo, or something that like a natural substance. I tried to really stay away from plastics, and I tried to really downsize the amount of things that I was purchasing.
hmm.
Um, so yeah, I forget what my point with that was, but that's kind of the reason that I was doing it.
Yeah.
But I found that it had cascade effects on, how often I became distracted, or, the number of responsibilities that I had to pay attention to each week, like just the maintenance of living became much less, which was really nice.
Yeah. One of my lines that I like a lot from a movie, it was a fun movie, is Fight Club. And there's this line where he says that the more things you own, the more those things own you, or something to that effect. But
Hmm.
yeah. So then it continues, mask your brightness. And this is a interesting one. And I'm not 100% sure where they wanted to go with this, but the sense I get here is it's about not trying to stand out or become obvious in terms of, status or social acclaim, or in some way trying to stand out. Um, and it's in studying a lot of where anthropologists were going with things like more egalitarian cultures, thinking back to more of the indigenous peoples and how they would organize life in the hunter-gatherer phase. There was a lot that was done to try and keep somebody rising to positions of power. So like the strongman type of rise to prominence, and different ways that they would work to kind of keep them humble or keep them in line so that there wasn't an individual that was trying to rise up. And maybe this is a carryover of some of those thoughts that, if we're going to have more of a harmonious social arrangement between people, we have to be careful not to try to shine too bright, that maybe there's different skills that we have, and maybe they are a benefit to the community, but we have to do it in such a way where we're not trying to rise in status so much as how can we truly benefit others type of a question. Did you have any other thoughts on what that might be getting at?
Yeah, this one, like you said, this one's kind of interesting. Um, I guess I could take from it that it's, kind of how you're appearing to other people. Um, I always interpret brightness as like the joy that you are radiating. But
Mm,
it could mean like how you said, like try not to be the one standing out.
mm.
Like, the sun is very bright. It's very obvious in the sky. Um, so it, if I look at it that way, it does make more sense with what you were saying. Um, but I don't think if your brightness is coming naturally, I don't think you should mask it. But I don't think you should force brightness.
Yeah, it's a tough one in our culture because so much is based on, how you actually move ahead or move forward in this world is about standing out and about showing your skills and your abilities and your utility, your usefulness. And so it's hard for us to think about why you would want to, you know, put a lid on that or not let it stand out. I think in that, let's say that more indigenous worldview, that might be part of what's being brought across that Paleolithic perspective is that, the skills are valuable to the community, but it's more of a recognizing that almost along the lines of when we talk about, determinism, how who we are and the skills that we have are not necessarily because of things that we've done, but things that have been done to us, in terms of our genetics, in terms of how we were raised, who our parents were, the time and place of our birth, and how we grew up. And that those things all come together to enable us with certain things that we need to be mindful of the fact that so many of these things we can't really take credit for. They can still be helpful in the sense of, how do I get along in this world and how do I help with the community? But when we start to get a big head about some of these things, then we can forget that we owe all of these attributes about who we are to things other than ourselves. And so maybe this is a way of keeping that in check of, yep, I'm still going to be able to apply and use my skills for the good of our community, but not so much of trying to take personal credit, which is another theme that we've seen throughout the Tao Te Ching. It's much more of recognizing how do we create a social harmony, and part of that social harmony is, how do we not try to create these different levels of value for people, right? They might have different skills. It's not saying that everybody is the same, but it's that at a fundamental level, we're still just people. And what other gifts and talents we have should be used from that perspective, as opposed to more of a prideful perspective or more of a, look at me perspective. Then we have this fun one. Be at one with the dust of the earth.
Hmm.
Yeah. Uh, do you have any initial thoughts on this?
Yeah, to me it's saying lay down in the dirt and make dirt angels. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know. I think if you think about the dust of the earth, it just kind of blows where the wind takes it and settles where it settles, and it's just kind of a go with the flow, is what I'm getting from it.
Mhm. It's also something that's, in a sense, we could talk about being beneath you, right? Like we actually stand on the dust of the earth. And so this idea of being at one, if we think about in a more of a literal sense, these hierarchies that get constructed, a lot of our goals are how do we rise above, not how do we get low, and especially how do we keep from, being in the dirt, right? It's like there's a contrast that we keep seeing, like when they talk about Tao in terms of being like water, one of its attributes that they refer to is that it goes into the low places where people don't want to go. And I think this is another way of talking about that in terms of how do we become, one or feel comfortable even at these low positions. And maybe even getting rid of that whole concept of it being low versus high, that these are all just places that somebody might find themselves, but we can be comfortable with those. I think maybe it also ties into a little bit more of that idea of how do we start to see other people as the same too, as opposed to someone beneath us or things that are beneath us. Then it kind of pulls this section together by saying this is primal, and this is actually the word. Uh, uh, Again, I apologize if I pronounce things incorrectly, but I believe it's something along Schwan. Um, is the word that we've seen before. So this word Schwan is actually could be translated as dark or mysterious. So it would be saying this is a dark union or a mysterious union. Here they're taking it in the sense of primal, like getting back to this foundational way of thinking about things. And this reminds me of back in chapter 1, where this term is used, and it talks about two different ways that we can perceive the world. We can perceive the world from the perspective of absence, in which case it says we're perceiving everything as a mystery, or we can perceive things from the perspective of presence, in which we're seeing the manifestations. And then it says, but both of these are actually the same thing. So we're getting into the concept that, yep, we're seeing all these individuated things, especially, from our human perspective, but at an underlying level, there's a way in which these are all kind of connected, and recognizing that connectedness amongst what seems separate would be considered this mystery, or in this case it's like this dark one translation has dark enigma, right? Like this dark mystery. And in that context, I've tried to say that this isn't meant in a negative sense in how we associate darkness typically in our culture, but more in the sense of that yin versus yang approach, and that there's a steady movement within the Daodejing to have more of a reassertion of that yin perspective, because one of the critiques of the social chaos that they find themselves in at the time of the Warring States period would be seen from the Daodejing's perspective as a problem of too much yang, this idea of control and trying to manage things, where we need a little bit more of this novelty or this creativity or this generativeness, which would be symbolized in this darkness. And so it concludes in chapter 1 by saying this is darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding. And here we have this process where we kind of disentangle ourselves from a lot of the cultural constraints that are trying to captivate and shape our desires in certain ways that are of benefit to the larger hierarchical structure, but they might not actually be true to reality. So the more we kind of disentangle ourselves from that to be able to have more of a direct experience of life, then we're getting back to that idea of how do we see that union in which things are connected, and at the same time it's wrapped up in this mystery, this darkness that here is talked about primal, like something that happens even before humans, this unique way of understanding the connectedness of everything. So from that initial quandary of, those who know do not speak and those who speak do not know, well, how do we, assuming that the ideal state would be that we want to be someone who knows, it goes through this process of how do we, in a sense, almost unlearn certain things or protect ourselves from certain things so that we can have more of a direct experience. And that direct experience is much harder to put into words, but it's something that we can come to experience in life in the same way that we understand riding a bike in a different way from just talking about it versus actually doing it. Here, it's that experience of life directly rather than just somebody trying to explain what it is. And this brings us back to this primal union of ultimately seeing the connectedness of everything. And it really starts to challenge a lot of the different values and distinctions that culture is trying to create in order to shape us in a certain direction. Any thoughts on that before I go to the next part?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about it in this way because it's telling you to do things in one way instead of doing them the other. And then it's saying, just be natural, you know? So it's kind of a funny,
Yeah,
kind of a funny thing to think about.
it is. It's suggesting that there is something that you should do,
Yeah.
where they're saying that part of the problem is that somebody else has, you know, put a should on you, right?
Uh-huh.
And so it's, I would say the one thing that in terms of the contrast is this is trying to open your perception to see more of what's going on so you can have more of a critical eye, whereas the other should is much more don't question, fall in line, do what we say, kind of an approach. So yes, it's suggesting another way that someone should be, but the way that it's proposing is one where it's encouraging as much free thought and experience of life as possible, whereas the other tends to be more, fit into our box that we have for you. And those, of course, are extremes, right? Just
Yeah.
to try and bring about a certain point. And so we always are going to have to look at every situation again as unique, and it's this basic approach to things that helps us to understand what we should do in a given situation. And that's one of the things that I like, and a lot of times people are frustrated with in terms of the Tao Te Ching, is it doesn't give you specifics like here's the 1, 2, 3 you get if you follow this process of kind of unlearning this cultural constructs. It's going to tell you now do step 1, 2, 3. It doesn't. It just leaves it open because, again, if they tried to give you, like, here's universally what you do in this situation, it would be running contrary to the very thing they're trying to expose, which is the uniqueness of each situation. So then what happens if somebody gets there? Those who have achieved this state, it's going to say, do not distinguish between friends and enemies, between good and harm, between honor and disgrace. This is part of what we were noticing when it was talking about tempering or dulling the sharpness. There's value judgments that tend to guide or direct how people should act. And those are usually along these, like, almost like moral lines that are used as a type of control for how people should behave. And here it's suggesting these are things that need to not be looked at, in the sense that we're going to, if we put these boxes and these categories and impose those on the world so that they fit into patterns that make life easier to navigate, that we're going to be potentially misrepresenting or misunderstanding the actual state of things, because you can never keep things totally in those buckets. They don't fit as nicely and neatly as we would like them to. And so the person who's really achieved this unlearning to have more of that direct experience is going to start to recognize these categories don't really line up all the time. It's like that parable of the farmer and the horse, right? Where the same exact issue about the horse escaping or the horses coming back or the son breaking his leg and not being called to war, each of these situations kind of flip-flops in terms of what the townspeople are saying in terms of this is a fortunate thing or an unfortunate thing, because the context continues to evolve, and what initially seemed negative then turned out to be positive. And there's so much of our value judgments that happen in that way, that if we can learn to stop trying to make judgments on these categories, but instead see what's actually happening in this present moment, then we're going to be in a better place to know what's actually happening, as opposed to getting situations to fit into context that we bring to the story, right? And really, I think at this point, we can start to see a little bit more of what was being intended by those who talk, do not know. So if we think about the farmer's story, everybody's telling him, this or that about how to evaluate the situation. And his response is, we'll see, right? And I think that's part of what's happening with that. Those who know do not talk, and those who talk do not know, is the talking part has to do more with how we are evaluating and judging different situations. And so this ideal state, right? Those who have achieved this state move away from that way of talking. They move away from trying to have certainty about things and laying things out as this is the way they are or the way that they should be. And the way it concludes is that this is the highest state of being. Now, this is, again, the Feng and English translation, but I want to bring in one other one, because there's an aspect here that's not really being translated, and it's the Tianxia, the under heaven, is being used in this line again. So another translation, this is from Ellen Chen, says, therefore, such person, it's interesting, it just says such person, it says such a person or something along those lines. But anyway, such person is exalted in the world. So there's this idea of this being valued or exalted, the highest state. And the implication is it's a person who has actually gone through this uneducation process to arrive at that state of experiential knowing is exalted. It says here, the translation is exalted of the world. Another way we could talk about Tianxia is all under heaven, which can be in reference to the realm of human activity. So all humans exalt this type of a person, or it can actually be um, really more understood as like the empire, right? And so we're probably getting back to the person who would be in that position of rulership would be exalted if they were actually functioning from the perspective that we've seen going down this list. That doesn't exclude the personal application, but there's always kind of this concern about how does this tie back into the problem of the Warring States period. And some of the key issues that are brought up with as problems from the leaders is when they move into that position for the sake of gain or for the sake of chasing their own ideas and desires, or when they start to become biased or not evenly applying the laws or how things work. That the more that they can operate from the perspective of for the benefit of the people, which is where that mandate of heaven comes into play, then the better society is going to function because the person at the top has fully embraced these concepts. And that kind of brings us pretty much at time here. So we've got a few minutes left if you have some additional thoughts you'd like to discuss.
I don't think so. Most
Yeah,
of it was in the middle of there.
how it unfolded.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good challenge to work through, I thought, on this chapter to understand how those different pieces fit together.
Yeah, it's like a little puzzle.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and bring it to a close then. And if you've been watching this video and you'd like to join our live Zoom conversation that happens on Friday mornings, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe. And you'll also get a weekly email that has the Zoom link as well as the most recent videos that have been published. And if you happen to be in the Southern California area, it'll have an invitation for where we meet in person. So with that, I want to thank you again for joining and hope to see you again next time.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.
Mhm.